The morning, my son Tobias called me in a panic. It was 6:48 on a Thursday in February, and the snow was still coming down over Kitchener in the way it does in the middle of winter. Heavy, indifferent, like it had all the time in the world. I was at the kitchen table with my second cup of tea. The mug had a chip on the handle that I kept meaning to replace. The radio was on low. Ordinary sounds. An ordinary morning. Then my phone lit up. I saw his name and answered right away. A mother always answers. "They froze it!" he said before I could speak. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Raw, stripped of the confidence he'd spent 38 years constructing. The whole line of credit. Without warning. What does that even mean? How does that happen? I set down my tea. Outside, a snowplow rumbled past, scraping the road clean. "Tobias," I said, "slow down. Tell me what happened." But he wasn't listening to me. He rarely did anymore. That was the thing about my son. For years, for most of his adult life, really, he had treated my opinion the way people treat the weather. Noted vaguely, then moved on without it. I was his mother. I was 63 years old. I had spent my working life as an accounts payable clerk at a manufacturing firm. Not exactly the kind of resume that commands attention in a room full of people talking about business expansion and investment leverage. What Tobias didn't know, what neither he nor his wife Petra had ever bothered to ask, was that 22 years of accounts payable teaches you things. It teaches you how to read a ledger. It teaches you what a balance sheet looks like when it's been arranged carefully to mislead. It teaches you to notice when the numbers don't quite add up the way someone is hoping you won't notice. For months before that February morning, I had been noticing. My husband Clarence Garland died 4 years ago. Quietly, as he'd lived, a heart attack in the garden on a warm September afternoon, pulling up the last of the tomato plants. We had been married for 39 years. He was a kind man, a steady man, and his death left a hole in this house that I have never entirely stopped stepping around. Tobias came home for the funeral. Celeste flew in from Calgary with her husband and the grandchildren. For 3 weeks, the house was full. Then it wasn't. Then it was just me. I wasn't helpless. I want to be clear about that. I had managed our household budget for decades. I understood our RRSP accounts, our pension, the mortgage we had paid off 11 years before Clarence died. I knew the name of our insurance broker. I had a folder, labeled in my own handwriting, filed alphabetically, that contained every important document in our lives. But grief does something to you. It makes even simple decisions feel enormous. And Tobias, to his credit, stepped in. He offered to help me manage the estate paperwork. He lived in Toronto, an hour away. He came on weekends, sat at the kitchen table, explained things in a patient voice that I now recognize was the voice adults use when they've already decided you won't understand. "You don't need to worry about this part, Mum," he'd say, sliding a document toward me. "It's just administrative, standard stuff." I trusted him. He was my son. The first time his wife Petra Garland came with him, I made tea and put out the good biscuits. Petra was 36, lean and sharp the way some people are. Everything about her precise, considered, nothing wasted. She worked in business development and spoke in a way that made everything sound inevitable. "With everything consolidated properly," she said, that first afternoon, "you'll be in a much better position for tax efficiency." I nodded. I smiled. I signed several things that Tobias slid across the table. I am not proud of that, but I want anyone who has ever sat in that chair, the one still warm from someone you buried, the grief still so loud you can barely hear yourself think, to understand how it happens. You trust the people who show up. You stop asking questions because you're tired, and because asking feels like distrust, and because they are your family. The questions came later, slowly, the way water finds a crack. It started the autumn after Clarence died, when I noticed my monthly bank statements had stopped arriving. I called the bank. They told me my address had been updated. I had not updated my address. When I pressed, they gave me an address on Glenwood Avenue in Toronto. Tobias's house. I called Tobias. He apologized immediately. "Clerical error," he said. He'd fix it, and he did. The statements started coming again within 2 weeks. I almost let it go. I almost told myself it was nothing. But I had 22 years of accounts payable behind me. And accounts payable teaches you one thing above all. The clerical errors that get explained away quickly are usually the ones worth examining slowly. I began keeping a notebook. Small, spiral-bound, the kind I used to carry at the office. I wrote down dates, amounts, reference numbers. Every time something felt slightly off. A transaction I didn't recognize, a letter with unfamiliar letterhead, a charge from a company I couldn't place, I wrote it down. By the following spring, I had filled 43 pages. That was when I called Portia Beckwith. Portia and I had worked together for 6 years before she retired. She'd spent 30 years as a financial advisor, and she had the kind of mind that finds patterns the way a good accountant finds errors. Not by looking for them specifically, but by noticing when something isn't sitting the way it should. We'd kept in touch over the years. Christmas cards and the occasional lunch, the comfortable friendship of people who knew each other before the world got complicated. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon. I didn't explain much on the phone. I just said I had some documents I'd like her to look at. She came the following Saturday. I made coffee. I put the notebook on the table. She read for a long time. She didn't speak. She turned pages carefully without rushing, giving each entry its full due. Finally, she set the notebook down. "Millie," she said, "tell me about the papers you signed after Clarence died." I told her everything I could remember. The kitchen table, the patient voice, standard administrative stuff. "Don't worry about this part, Mom." Portia nodded slowly. "Do you have copies?" I thought I didn't. Then I remembered something. When Tobias brought papers for me to sign, I had, out of habit, the habit of 22 years, sometimes taken a photograph with my phone before signing. Not always. But sometimes, because that was what you did in accounts payable. You documented everything. You protected yourself with paper. Old habits. We went through my phone together that afternoon. I had 11 photographs of documents I had signed in the 14 months after Clarence died. Portia studied each one for a long time. "There's a holding company," she said finally. "Garland Property and Equity Holdings. Have you ever heard of it?" I had not. She turned my phone toward me. There, in the third photograph, a document I had signed assuming it was some form of estate administration, was my name. Millicent Garland, listed as a director. I stared at it for a very long time. "I've never heard of this company," I said. Portia's expression didn't change, which was somehow more frightening than if it had. "I know," she said. She helped me access the provincial business registry that afternoon. The company had been incorporated just 6 weeks after Clarence's funeral. 2 directors, Tobias Garland and Millicent Garland. My name had been added to a company I had never been told about, never attended a meeting for, never made a single decision for. But there was my signature on a document I'd been told was administrative. My hands were shaking by the time we found the next piece. Portia reached across and put her hand over mine. "Keep breathing," she said quietly. "You need to keep breathing." The holding company, we discovered, had been used to secure a significant line of credit for Tobias's construction business, Garland Build. The collateral on that line of credit included 2 things: a business property Tobias owned outright, and, listed there in plain language, equity associated with the primary residence of Millicent Garland. My house. The house Clarence and I had paid off 11 years ago. The house I had lived in for 31 years. And there was one more thing. One of the documents I had photographed, the one Tobias had described as a routine registered account update, appeared to authorize a restructuring of my RRSP. I had nearly $200,000 in that account. It was the savings of a lifetime, the money I was meant to live on. I don't have words for what that felt like. I have tried to find them, and they aren't there. I sat in my kitchen, in my house, at my table with the chip on the mug, and I understood something that took my breath entirely away. Tobias and Petra had not simply borrowed my name. They had borrowed my life, my home, my future, and they had done it in the months. When I was still learning how to live without Clarence. When I was the most vulnerable I had ever been. When I trusted them the most. "I am not a person who cries easily," I cried then. Portia sat beside me and said nothing, which was exactly right. After a while I stopped. I got up. I washed my face at the kitchen sink and looked out at the backyard, where Clarence had his tomato plants, and I thought, what would he say right now? He would say, "Get yourself a lawyer." I did. Portia connected me with an estate and financial litigation lawyer named Moira Ashe, a woman in her early 50s who practiced out of a small firm in Waterloo. She had direct eyes and a calm, unhurried voice, and she did not once suggest, not by word or expression, that I should have been more careful, or that I was foolish for trusting my own son. I was grateful for that more than I knew how to say. Over the following weeks, I met with Moira 4 times. I brought my notebook, my photographs, every document I could legitimately access. She pulled records from the business registry, the land title office, the relevant financial institutions. She explained each piece to me in terms that assumed I was intelligent. I hadn't realized how long I'd been waiting for someone to do that. "The collateral use of your property," she told me in our 3rd meeting, "was not disclosed to you in a way that would constitute proper informed consent. The document you signed was described to you as something entirely different. They said it was administrative." "Yes," she looked at me steadily. "That's the word they used." While all of this was happening, I continued living my life. I went to my book club on Wednesday evenings. I had lunch with my neighbor. I answered the phone when Tobias called, which he did, perhaps once a week, and I listened to him talk about the business, about contracts, about Petra's plans for expansion into a second market. I asked a question here and there, nothing that would raise suspicion. Just a mother keeping the conversation alive. I had become very good at listening. I had spent decades being dismissed. It turns out that being dismissed teaches you to watch. Celeste knew something was wrong before I told her. She called me on a Sunday in January, 2 weeks before Tobias's panicked 6:48 call, and asked in that careful way she had whether everything was all right. "Your voice sounds different," she said. "You sound, I don't know," coiled. I almost laughed. She had always read me better than Tobias had. I told her I was working through some things. "Mum," her voice dropped. "Is it money? Is something wrong with the estate?" There was a silence. She filled it herself, which told me she'd been wondering about this for some time. "I noticed something last summer," she said slowly. "When I was visiting. There was a letter on your counter from a company I didn't recognize. I asked Toby about it, and he said it was nothing. Just some administrative thing with your accounts." Administrative, that word again. "Cestes," I said. "I need you to trust me right now. I'm handling it. I have help." She was quiet for a long moment then. "Do you need me to come?" "Not yet," I said. "Soon." It was Moira who first used the word investigation. We were sitting in her office a week before the February morning, and she set a series of documents on the table between us. She walked me through the numbers. The line of credit Tobias had secured through the holding company was substantial, over $400,000. The interest payments had been irregular. Several large transfers had moved through accounts connected to the holding company at times that corresponded with significant withdrawals from accounts associated with my RRSP. "I've been in contact with the relevant institutions," Moira said carefully. "Based on the documentation, they are reviewing the authorizations. When that review reaches a certain point, there will likely be consequences for the account access." I understood her immediately. "How long?" I asked. "Not long." I nodded. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table, the mug with the chip, the radio on low. I waited. It was 6 days later that the phone rang at 6:48. "They froze it," Tobias said. "The whole line of credit, without warning." "What does that even mean? How does that happen?" I let him talk. He was frightened in the way people are frightened, when the thing they have built begins to shift beneath them, loudly, frantically, looking in every direction for someone else to be responsible. He mentioned the bank 3 times. He mentioned Petra. He did not once mention my name or my house or my RRSP. When he finally ran out of words, I said quietly, "You should come to Kitchener, Tobias." A pause. "What?" "Come see me, today if you can. We need to talk." He arrived at 2 o'clock. Petra was with him. I had expected that. I made tea. I put out the good biscuits. The same ones I'd put out the first afternoon. Petra came to help me with the estate. I noticed her notice that. A small flicker of recognition, and then her expression went smooth again. We sat at the kitchen table. "Mom," Tobias began, in the patient voice. "I know you've probably heard something about the business. I don't want you to worry. It's temporary. The bank has just flagged something routine." I set a folder on the table. He stopped speaking. Inside the folder were 12 pages. A copy of the Garland Property and Equity Holdings registration, with my name listed as a director. A copy of the land title search showing my home as collateral. A copy of the RRSP authorization document, with its real implications highlighted in yellow. Photographs of everything I had signed at this very table. Portia had helped me annotate each one. What I had been told. What it actually was. I watched my son read. I watched the color in his face change. I watched Petra's jaw tighten and then, very carefully, go still. "Where did you get these?" Tobias asked. His voice was quiet now. The panic had drained out and left something else behind. "I've been keeping records," I said. "I learned that at the office. 35 years ago. Document everything. You never know when you'll need it." Tobias looked at me. Really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. Not at the woman who put out the good biscuits and nodded along. At me. "Mom, I can explain." "I know the explanation," I said. "The business needed capital. The collateral made the line of credit possible. My name on the holding company made the structure work. And I was convenient because I was grieving and I trusted you and I signed things I was told were administrative." He opened his mouth, closed it. Petra had not spoken. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Wariness, and beneath it, something that might have been the beginning of respect. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said. "I want you to understand that. You are my son. I love you the way I have always loved you, completely and without condition. But what was done to me was wrong, and it has to be addressed." "Mum," his voice cracked. "Moira Ash has all of this," I said. "The bank's review is already underway. I wanted you to hear it from me first. That's the only reason I asked you to come today." Tobias looked at the table. He looked the way he used to look at 11 years old, when something he had done had caught up to him. Not defiant, not angry, just very young and very sorry. I had loved that boy with every part of me. I loved him still. That didn't make what he'd done acceptable. It just made it more painful. The two things can live side by side, they do. Petra spoke at last. Her voice was controlled, in the way that told me she was frightened. "What do you want to happen?" "My house is my house," I said. "My RRSP is mine. The collateral arrangements need to be unwound. Moira is working on the mechanism. The bank will require a resolution. That is not negotiable." She nodded. Very slightly. She understood leverage. They left an hour later. Tobias hugged me at the door. He held on longer than he had in years. I held on too because he was still my son. And because some things don't change regardless of what a person has done. After their car turned the corner, I called Celeste. "You can come now," I said. She was on a flight the next morning. The months that followed were not simple. There were meetings with Moira, documents and counter-documents, phone calls from people at the bank who spoke in careful language that said a great deal between the words. Tobias cooperated, in the end. Fully and without requiring a legal fight to do it. I believe that was the best of him surfacing through everything else. Petra, to her credit, did not obstruct. She was practical in the way that people are practical when the alternative is worse. Garland Build survived, reduced, restructured, the aggressive expansion plans set aside. The collateral arrangements were unwound. The holding company was dissolved. My house is my house again, in every sense. My RRSP, though it took time to fully restore, is intact. I no longer sign things at kitchen tables without reading them first. I no longer accept the word administrative as a replacement for an explanation. Celeste spent 3 weeks with me that winter. We sorted through the last of Clarence's things, boxes I had been avoiding, and we talked more honestly than we had in years. One afternoon she asked me something I wasn't expecting. "Why didn't you confront him sooner, when you first noticed the statements?" I thought about it before I answered. "Because I wanted to be wrong," I said. "That's the honest answer. And I needed to be sure I wasn't before I did anything that couldn't be undone." She nodded slowly. "You were sure." "I was sure." My relationship with Tobias is not what it was. I don't know yet if it will fully repair. Trust, once it learns how fragile it is, becomes careful of itself. But he calls me on Sundays now. He asks real questions and he waits for the answers. That is something. This past spring, I started volunteering at a seniors center here in Kitchener. A financial literacy program, once a month, women mostly. Some widowed like me, some recently separated, all of them trying to understand documents that had always been handed off to someone else to read. I recognize them the moment they walk in, that particular expression. The one that says, I should probably know this already, and I'm embarrassed that I don't. On the third session, a woman of about 75 came up to me afterward. Her name was Olive. She had a worried look that I recognized because I had worn it myself for the better part of 2 years. My son handles everything, she said quietly. He always says not to worry. I looked at her steadily. Do you have copies of what you've signed? She shook her head. Start there, I said. I don't tell that story to frighten anyone. I tell it because I want every woman in that room to understand something it took me too long to learn. Trusting the people you love is not the same as removing yourself from your own life. You can love someone with your whole heart and still read the document before you sign it. You can be generous and still be informed. You can be a devoted mother and still say, quietly, clearly, calmly, that is not acceptable. I am 63 years old. I spent 22 years learning how numbers work, then spent 30 years letting other people be the experts. The numbers hadn't changed. I had simply stopped trusting that I was allowed to understand them. I understand them now, and no one will ever freeze that.